I've got our Director General, Mr. Willie Walsh, as well as our Chief Economist, Marie Owens-Thomsen, here to go through the first session where we'll be looking at the industry's performance. And I guess we'll start, Willie, with maybe a question for you. And since we're at the end of 2022, how would you characterize the last 12 months?
Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Great to see so many of you in the room, and look forward to engaging with you over the next day or two. So as we come towards the end of this year, I think we have to be positive about what we've seen through the year and optimistic about what we're going into in 2023. Without question, the recovery is strong and has gathered momentum as we've gone through the year. The exception to that, obviously, is what's happening in China and the knock-on effect of that in Asia. But if we look at the rest of the world, we've seen a strong recovery, still below where we were in 2019. Domestic markets are pretty much back to where they were in 2019. International markets still recovering. So given what we'd come through in 2020, 2021, I think we have to be very positive about 2022. The headwinds we face are significant, but to me, and you've probably heard me say this, I would describe them as sort of business as usual headwinds and challenges. We've seen most of these before, maybe not on the scale that we're witnessing at the moment in relation to inflation, but we still have positive economic growth, as Mari will talk about in a short while. So when I look at 2022 and 2023, I'm an optimist at heart, so I'm being optimistic about the outlook, but I think I'm being realistic about what it is we've seen during the year.
Okay, great. Maybe a couple of specific issues in 2022. So, for example, is COVID pretty much behind us? Do you see the industry having sort of put all those regulations behind and we're moving forward, or?
Well, I think COVID is clearly endemic now, and with the exception of China, which is still pursuing zero COVID, most areas of the world have relaxed or removed the restrictions that were in place. And I think that's a real positive. And I think looking back on many of these restrictions, it's very clear to us now with the data that's available that the restrictions had very little, if any, positive impact on constraining or reducing the transmission of the virus. And I think that's an important message for governments and regulators around the world. All of the analysis that has been done, whether it's by ourselves or by other independent bodies, shows that at best it slowed down the peak by a couple of days, not weeks, not months, days. But the economic impact of the restrictions that were put in place was devastating for many industries, including our own. So I wouldn't say we should forget about COVID. I think there are a lot of very important lessons to be learned from what it is we've gone through over the last few years. And without question, we will face another one of these challenges. So I think it is important that we reflect on what went well. And there probably were a couple of things that went well, but more importantly, what went wrong, and ensure that we don't repeat those mistakes going forward. So I think, as I've said before, a lot of lessons to be learned, a lot of valuable data that can be analyzed, and going forward, it's important that we reaffirm with regulators and governments that decisions should be based on readily available data rather than emotion, as we have seen on many occasions through the year.
Okay, great. Another, I suppose, memory that people will have of 2022 are some of the disruptions that we saw over the summer period at a few hubs. Do you think those issues have been well dealt with? Are we looking for a smooth Christmas season or year-end season?
I think with few exceptions, we should be reasonably comfortable that the peak Christmas season should go well. There were a few airports where the performance was poor. There were a few airports where it continued to be poor beyond what I would have considered an acceptable period of time. I've highlighted Heathrow and Schiphol as being the two major outliers. You know, there were other airports with problems. We saw issues at Manchester for a little while, Gatwick, Dublin, some other European airports, Paris briefly. But the problems at Schiphol and Heathrow were, went on far too long. In fact, I have a chart maybe just to show you here. These figures are important, and I've just taken a selection of figures. This is from Heathrow. They published their quality. It's under the quality rebate and bonus scheme, because as you know, they get bonuses when they perform well, and they have to pay rebates when they don't perform. But this shows you the performance of Heathrow for security queuing, T2, T3, T5, and the T5 transfer area going back to January of 2022. So these are their figures. These are Heathrow figures. And these are figures that, based on how they measure them, which for anybody in this room who's gone through an airport will realize is not the way a customer measures a queue. But you can see here they're required under their quality standards to have 95% of people through in less than 5 minutes. If you look at T5 in July, I highlighted July because that's when they introduced the passenger cap. They hit 39.28% of people getting through in 5 minutes. And they measure that time from the time you scan your boarding pass going into the security area to the time it takes you to get to the head of the queue before you put your bags on the conveyor belt. So not the time that it actually takes you to get through from having checked in to the far side of security. So if you're queuing outside of the security area, you're not in a queue. You're just standing around, enjoying yourself. So in many cases, the chaos we witnessed was not being accurately measured. But these figures are appalling. And they continued beyond the introduction of the passenger cap at Heathrow. So, we had John Holland-Kay at Heathrow going on about it's the airline's fault. They didn't have enough people to deal with baggage. This has nothing to do with airlines. This is Heathrow's performance. And quite frankly, these figures are shocking and should not be tolerated. And the fact that they continued into October, which is the latest data that's available, it'll be interesting to see what they produce for November. But I think these problems went on far too long in some airports, Heathrow and Schiphol being the two that I would call out. A lot of other airports, in fact, I would say most airports functioned pretty well. Here at Geneva, I've traveled out of Geneva quite a lot, and I have to say my experience in traveling through Geneva has been quite positive. Yes, there are queues, but there were queues in previous years. But I think the airports generally have managed them well.
Great. So the other thing that I believe will stick in our memories from 2022 and unfortunately into 2023 is the war in Ukraine. And that has had some, at least operational impacts on the airlines, but Willie, maybe do you want to describe a bit how you see the impact of the war on the industry?
Yeah, well, clearly, I think everybody would join with me in saying we want this war to come to an end and we want peace to prevail in the region. The impact on the industry has been, at one level, limited in terms of the international market from Russia and from Ukraine are relatively small in the overall scale of things. So it hasn't had a major direct financial impact on the industry. Where it has impacted significantly, obviously, has been volatility in the oil price. And that has significantly increased the price of oil through the year and well above what we had originally forecast for the year. So I was just looking earlier. This time last year, we were predicting an average oil price through 2022 of $67 a barrel. I think in the data that Murray will show you, we're showing an average oil Brent price of 103. So a 54% increase in the oil price, largely down to the impact of the war in Ukraine and the volatility created in the oil price. And that clearly has added significantly to the airline's cost base through 2022, and Murray will show you some of that as well. While that's impacted in all airlines, the impact of the closure of Russian airspace has also impacted on some airlines, particularly the likes of Finnair, who've had to rebuild their network almost completely. It hasn't had the impact that, had this happened in a normal operating year, mainly because with the closure of China and the lingering restrictions in Asia, traffic between Asia and Europe and vice versa has been heavily impacted through the year. So we haven't seen as many aircraft flying through Russian airspace because the government restrictions in Asia have restricted the amount of flights. Had it happened in a normal year, I think that would have added significantly to the disruption being experienced by European and Asian carriers, because clearly operating through Russian airspace is a significant part of the network. So as we rebuild in 2023, I think we will see increasing impact as a result of the war, principally through the closure of Russian airspace.
Okay, great. And then I guess the last thing was 2022 was the first full year of the airline's commitment to net zero by 2050. Do you think we made enough progress on that over the year?
Yeah, I think we're making good progress. Clearly, this is a very important target for the industry. We're pleased to see that at the ICAO Assembly earlier this year, governments have also aligned with the industry now with their long-term aspirational goal of net zero in 2050. It's important that we turn that aspirational goal into something more concrete. But I think the positive about that is the industry and the governments around the world, regulators, we should be aligned now, and that must be seen as an opportunity to ensure that we have the right policy frameworks in place that will enable the industry to make the transition from where we are today to net zero in 2050. We believe the most important part of that is widespread availability of sustainable aviation fuels, and you're going to hear a lot more about that tomorrow. So establishing these targets are very important. Turning those targets into concrete action now becomes even more important. But critically for us, we want to make sure that we have the right policy frameworks in place that enable the industry through transition. And that is going to be challenging. It's going to be very expensive. This will clearly add to the operating costs of airlines. We're seeing some of that this year. We'll see a little bit more in 2023, but from 2024 onwards, where we're going to see increasing costs associated with the transition to net zero. So it's something that the industry recognizes. We're going into this transition with our eyes open. We know it's going to be hard work. We know it's going to be expensive, but we're absolutely determined to get there. And I think making those commitments during the depths of the worst crisis the industry has ever shown shows the determination that this industry has to ensure that we play our part in addressing the environmental impact that we have.
Okay, great. I think with that, we've covered the sort of main features of 2022. So I'll ask Marie to help us now start looking into 2023 and what she sees in her crystal economics ball for the industry in the coming 12 months.
Okay.
Perfect. So, and as you're going up to the podium, I'll just remind everyone again about our commitment and agreement to an embargo. So again, we're still under embargo until 10:45 this morning. So with that, Marie, it's all yours.
Of course, GDP growth is one of the traditional main drivers of our industry, so I will start there, even if in our recent history it's been the presence of restrictions or absence of restrictions that has really been the main driver of traffic in our industry. So we have a lot of discussion about recession, and rarely is it specified what people actually mean when they use that word. And I think this picture shows that what they might mean is this really quite sharp economic slowdown, but we are actually not at all today in the space of a global recession. So we can see that GDP growth slowed from 6% last year to 3%, close to 3% this year, and below 2% next year. So this slowdown, I think people perceive as recessionary. Now, let me be clear that individual countries are clearly experiencing recessions. Of course, Russia, we think perhaps -10, Ukraine -30, and other countries will also experience recessions this year and next. But the global recession ought to be possible to avoid. So two important facts that help us avoid this global recession is, on the one hand, on your left hand, the rising nominal interest rates. Yeah, we know that all the central banks are increasing nominal interest rates in order to combat inflation. Now, as economists, we like to keep things real. So we take away the inflation rate from the nominal interest rate and we arrive at the real interest rate. And you can see that it is mostly still negative or low. The two countries that we see here that already have positive real rates are Russia and Brazil. But for the most part, interest rates are still in real terms negative, and that means that monetary policy is still supporting the economy at this stage. On the right-hand side, you see these incredible unemployment figures. This is really remarkable, and as I like to point out, after the global financial crisis, we talked a lot about the jobless recovery. Now, today, we are in this most fortunate and unusual situation that we can talk about the job-rich economic slowdown. This is absolutely phenomenally supportive, of course, of global GDP when countries are posting historic lows in their unemployment rates. We do anticipate this to change at some point in time during 2023, but as long as more people are working than ever before, this is more positive for the global economy than the fact that their incomes are, the purchasing power of their incomes is being reduced by the rate of inflation. So this is definitely underpinning growth at the moment. Now, on the negative side, as a rule, we say about the global economy that high oil prices and a high US dollar are GDP negatives. It tends to act that way. And of course, on the left-hand side, you see crude oil, the jet fuel price in green, and the spread between the two in red. So here we have a second absolutely unusual phenomenon in that this spread between crude and jet fuel prices is so high. As you can see, today it represents about 1/3 of the jet fuel price. And we think that this is intimately related to limited refining capacity, and that therefore there's every reason to expect this spread to remain high also next year. Plus the fact that it's sort of a sad thing for our industry that we will benefit less than other industries from declines in the Brent price, given that we use jet fuel. So that cost base is likely to remain elevated. And of course, it's even more elevated for everybody who has to pay for these energy imports in dollars if they are not earning those dollars themselves. So with this absolutely stunning appreciation of the dollar that you can see on the right, we all understand the amounts that this adds to the cost base for all non-dollar earning airlines around the world. So those are indeed the main headwinds. But in spite of those headwinds, we have managed to realize this kind of improvement in our activity, which again points to the fact that it's not really yet the real economy that's gripping on traffic. It is still the evolution on restrictions or no restrictions. So for the industry as a whole, we have 74% of 2019 levels, and of course cargo, as you can clearly see, the green line in this chart, has been the saving grace, so to speak, for our industry throughout the pandemic period. Of course, being relatively less impacted by these travel restrictions, cargo could really come to the fore and help us to at least some extent buffer what we have experienced through 2020 and 2021. And domestic is second in rank because there too we have a relatively lesser impact of these travel restrictions, but now we can see that even international is catching up with the other two market segments. So looking forward into the Northern Hemisphere's winter months, which tends to be a rather quieter period, I think this chart is quite encouraging because it points to a sustained level of activity into this lower activity period. We have a bit of an impact on domestic traffic here. I would argue that this is also very intimately related to what's happening in China. And of course, these curves would look differently if China were open to traffic. That remains the key variable, both for our industry and for the global economy. The longer China remains in various forms of lockdown, the higher the risk of a global recession. And of course, the longer it will take for our industry to get back to where it needs to be. So when we look at our forecast for the future, it looks like this. So clearly we are still not yet at the 2019 levels. We believe our industry will reach that level in 2024, led by the US in 23, and with Asia Pacific notably lagging in 2025. And we can see also that even as we approach these 2019 levels, we're still below where we thought that we were going to be before we had this crisis. So that remains a fact. And the risks to our forecasts, we believe, are skewed to the downside, primarily by what we have just briefly discussed, and of course, notably the presence or absence of travel restrictions. Right, so this is what I just mentioned. Here you see sort of the regional profile of the recoveries and of course, how Asia Pacific as a region is heavily skewed by what's going on in China. So there are definitely bright spots elsewhere in the region. And we can then see how we expect China to fully recover and regain its prominence in terms of global aviation traffic as the line progresses upwards more strongly in the latter half of our forecast horizon here. So America leads, followed by Europe and the Middle East, and the other regions thereafter. Now, of course, more traffic, logically speaking, means better financial performance, and indeed that's what we're finding also in our numbers. And I must say that this evolution from nearly 140 billion loss in 2020 to something just under 7 billion this year is an absolutely phenomenal performance. Every other crisis in our industry has been in the magnitudes of a couple of percentage points lost traffic, compared to what we experienced in 2020. And the recovery time after the previous crisis was 2 to 3 years. Now, in 4 years' time, we are able to get back to profitability from this absolutely massive hole that 2020 caused for our industry. And I think that is just nothing short of phenomenal. But we can also see that given that the revenue and the cost side of our industry is close to approaching 800 million, profits of some 4 to 5 billion, we understand that the margins are very slim and that we remain, of course, highly sensitive to the evolutions of all these factors that we have discussed. So this is the split between cargo revenue and passenger revenue. So of course, cargo increased its share when passenger traffic was largely absent, and there's some realignment of these relativities going forward as of course the passenger traffic returns and belly capacity returns and so on. So the share in the total of cargo is likely to go down going forward, but it still remains in absolute dollars well above the 2019 level. So in terms of profitability, we sort of follow the same regional pattern, but a year earlier. So we believe that the North American airlines will be profitable already this year, followed by Europe and the Middle East next year, and the other regions will have to look to 2024 or beyond before they likely reach profitability again. And of course, we cannot forecast profitability without having load factors approaching the break-even load factors. So these are total load factors, and you can see that we're just crossing that line, being able to have this positive outlook on the performance for 2023. And as I sort of alluded to already, that the load factors in the cargo space are likely to moderate somewhat going forward, given the additional belly capacity that's coming into the industry. So connectivity comes in many forms. Yeah? It's not just a question of flying the maximum amount of passengers between two destinations. It's also about flying to lots of destinations with perhaps fewer passengers, so that we can actually connect more remote communities together. It still remains a fact that the poorest countries in the world are those that are predominantly those that are landlocked in the middle of Africa without any forms of connectivity. So, and we know that throughout human history, every improvement, you know, when people started to use boats and then rail and so on and so forth, every such innovation has caused a leap in economic development and in per capita GDP. Not saying that we're the only ones that matter in terms of economic development, but that we play an important part, I think, is undoubtedly the case. So this is, again, a tribute to our industry, how we are managing to restore connectivity rapidly to the 2019 levels. This is unique city pairs in the blue line, and how we are able to do that at a progressively lower cost for everybody is a huge boom in the democratization of air travel. And with that, I thank you for your kind attention.
Great. Thanks very much, Marie. Now, Willie, you've heard Marie's take on 2023. Obviously, there are some headwinds with the economic situation, et cetera, but in your mind, what worries you most about the year ahead?
Yeah, I don't think we should be too worried. As I said, when I look at these challenges, you know, high oil prices, high inflation, low GDP, we've seen these before. You know, so I think airline management teams know what will be necessary going into this period. It's a very different challenge to what we witnessed in 2020 with the almost total collapse of flying. You know, you go back May 2020, passenger RPKs were down 95% versus the previous year. So what we're looking at now is a period of slower economic growth. Obviously, the unknown bit, which Marie alluded to, was what happens with China. You know, when does China start to reopen, or does China start to reopen? I think most people have an expectation that that will happen in 2023. You know, we're seeing some signs of a relaxation in some areas of the restrictions there. So I think given that we're still in recovery, you know, recovering much of the international, while domestic markets have almost fully recovered, but international markets still have scope to recover. I think airline management teams should be reasonably optimistic about the outlook for 2023. It's still going to be a challenging period, and you know, nowhere close to where we were in the period between 2010 and 2019. But I think there are positives there. As Murray said, the economic environment is probably the area where most people will express some concern. And if anything, there's probably more risk on that side than there is upside. But as I said, from an industry point of view, we are forecasting profitability in 2023 with a number of regions joining North America in terms of profit. So, you know, my view is, you know, let's look at the positives, recognize that we're going to have to work hard, recognize that decisions will need to be a little bit more cautious than maybe they would have been, and you know, recovering networks, given the uncertainty in some markets, clearly will be something that a lot of airline management teams will be focused on. But interestingly, you know, we had a Board of Governors meeting last week. One of the areas of concern that was expressed by a number of the airline CEOs was the availability of spare parts, both airframe and engine, and how that might impact on their ability to add additional capacity in 2023. We were aware of disruption to supply chains during this year. We've highlighted that on a number of occasions. But the degree to which the CEOs around the table expressed concern about their availability of parts, and I think particularly engine parts was something that didn't surprise me, but I think the scale of it certainly was a lot worse than I had realized. So that's something we'll be keeping an eye on as we go through the early part of 2023, because it would be a shame to see our ability to recover impacted by external factors like that, in the same way as our ability to recover during 2022 was impacted by a number of key airports not being able to cope with the increase in passenger demand.
Okay. Willie, you mentioned airports, and one of the concerns we had in 2022 was airports that were looking at raising their charges to airlines. And when you look into 2023, you see a very large revenue number and a very large cost number and not much in between. Are you concerned that some of our partners might want to add some cost to the industry?
Yeah, well, they're not our partners, let's be clear. We're in the airline industry, they're in the airport industry. The objectives that they have are different to ours, and I am deeply concerned. When you look at the profit that we're forecasting, we're talking about a little over $1 per passenger based on the number of passengers that we expect to fly globally. $1 per passenger profit. And airports are looking to increase their charges, in some cases by ridiculous amounts, way in excess of that. Even those that are sort of believing that they're being good are increasing their charges by well over $1 per passenger. And even in the best period, you go back to that 10-year period, 2010 to 2019, the industry on average made a profit of just over $10 per passenger in the best period of the industry, with net margins of about 5.4%. So, costs are a critical issue for all airlines. And at a time like recovery, with profit margins so slim, on top of the significant damage that was done to balance sheets through 2020, 2021, and indeed parts of 2022, it's very important that everybody understands just how fragile the recovery is. Yes, we're recovering. Yes, the momentum is improving. Yes, we expect it to continue to improve in 2023. But the margins we're operating with are very, very small. And we cannot tolerate a situation where airports in particular attempt to gouge airlines and their passengers by significant increase in airport charges. Every single cent matters to our members. Every single cent should be of concern to anybody looking at this industry, and we should not allow airports to get away with the significant increases that they're aiming for.
Great, thank you, Willie. And with that, I think I'll turn to Marie, because I think you've also been looking at the value chain and the distribution of profitability across that value chain. So maybe do you want to enlighten us on what your research has shown us?
We have undertaken a value chain study many times over the past years together with McKinsey, and we have renewed the study again this year. And so the value chain obviously includes everybody from air traffic control, aircraft manufacturers, maintenance, catering, ground handling. All of these various segments, links in the value chain, are analyzed in this report from the point of view of economic profits. So economic profits are not the same as the financial profits that we've just discussed. Economic profits are on the plus side, the return on invested capital, which we compare with the average rate of capital cost, the WACC. So the ROIC is compared with the WACC, and we can estimate, therefore, the economic profit. And this is from the point of view of investors who, under normal circumstances, would seek a return beyond the weighted average cost of capital. Yeah? So what we have traditionally always discovered, actually, and are still discovering in this report, is that this value chain is very disjointed. Over a long period of time, from 2012 to 2019, we have actually all the other parts of the value chain making this positive economic return, but not the airlines. And then we have 2021, when everybody was dragged into the negative economic results because the whole value chain depends on airlines and on airplanes being able to fly. That is absolutely marvelous. Thank you so much. So here you do see indeed this value chain performance from over the whole period of 2012 to 2019. So when you look at it like this, you think, okay, well, it doesn't so much matter perhaps that airlines are not returning this kind of economic profit. But when you turn to this picture, which is for 2021, well, you see how the issues that airlines are facing do actually, of course, translate into the economic performance of all the other parts of the value chain when times are tough. So clearly, we all have an interest across the value chain of working together and making and strengthening this value chain of ours. And I think this is something that we really need to analyze, all of us together. Another way of expressing sort of some of what's going on here is to look at the revenue flows to and from airlines. So at the top, you can see the flows into airlines from passengers and from cargo shippers. They go either directly or through an agent. And then in the lower half of this slide, you see where the money goes from the airlines to the various partners. And here we have been able to include the oil companies. We could not include the oil companies in the previous analysis, the charts that I just showed you, because we couldn't isolate the jet fuel component from their activities. Yeah, but here you can see that they are obviously the greatest recipients of flows coming from the airlines going to all of these suppliers. So clearly, we are all interdependent, and there is something slightly wrong with this picture. I hope that you agree. So one thing that could potentially be wrong, or certainly something that does influence the outcome across the value chain, is the market structure. So we can see that the GDSs and the OEMs, they have the top 5 companies in those businesses have 199% market shares. So that's an incredible type of market concentration that can be compared, for instance, to Google's share of the global search market, which stands at 83%. And then, of course, the other parts of the value chain become progressively more fragmented. So what the picture we get here, right, is of this very unbalanced value chain with oligopolistic and monopolistic pricing power in the upstream value chain, and then our environment, which is hyper-competitive and with this unique, nearly instantaneous price discovery of all our prices on all our routes across the globe. Very few industries provide that kind of price discovery. Financial markets, which is where I came from before having the fabulous opportunity of being here, they offer that on financial markets, but it's B2B, it's not B2C. So we are definitely uniquely positioned, I think, in this sense. So when we talk about market structure being an issue, I think that begs, of course, a number of questions, and questions about our own business models. And I think airlines should look at potential evolutions in business models and potential integration, horizontal or vertical. All of these business model options need to be explored in order to strengthen the value chain for everybody. But beyond our introspection, we also need to do certain things together across the value chain. We need to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 together. We need to use our data, the phenomenal data that the industry generates and collects, to the benefit of everybody across the value chain. And in doing so, we can most definitely capture efficiency gains that cannot be captured if we just look at ourselves and don't try to improve things together across the value chain in the interest not only of everybody's profitability, but also in the interest of improving the passenger experience. So that's it. Thank you very much. Thanks for finding the slides.
Great, thank you, Marie. I guess there are some learnings in that, but Willie, maybe one of our big challenges as an industry is decarbonization, and looking at that split of profitability across the industry, the value chain. How do you see any implications for how we decarbonize?
Yeah, well, what we've been saying is that the single biggest opportunity for our industry in the road to net zero is sustainable aviation fuels. What we need is greater production of sustainable aviation fuels. And as you saw from the presentation there, the traditional fuel suppliers have benefited significantly from revenue flows from our industry. And yet few, if any of them, have actually put real investment into the production of sustainable fuels. They've talked about it. In fact, in some cases, I've talked to some of these traditional fuel suppliers going back to 2005 about investment in sustainable aviation fuel. They talk a good talk, but that has not translated into action, and we need action. In 2021 and 2022, the industry has used every single drop of available sustainable aviation fuel, despite the significant premium to traditional jet kerosene. So you don't need to convince our industry to use sustainable fuels. You've got to convince the others to produce more sustainable fuels. And I think there's an opportunity there for some market disruption, because you don't need to have oil wells, obviously, to produce sustainable fuels. Sustainable fuels can be produced from several different feedstocks. So this gives a great opportunity for new entrants into the market. And we've seen some of that. Neste, for example, one of the largest producers of sustainable fuels. And there are others. And I think this is something that our industry will want to see as we go through this transition to net zero. And that's greater production. So we need governments to provide the right financial incentives for the production of sustainable aviation fuels in exactly the same way as they did to produce sustainable fuels for other forms of transport. So we're not looking for anything that's specific to us. We just want a fair treatment of our industry relative to other industries. And clearly, we need to ensure that airports have efficient infrastructure in place to ensure that the sustainable fuels can be delivered to the aircraft. Now, the beauty of sustainable fuel, as you know, is it's what we call a drop-in fuel. So it doesn't require any different infrastructure. Now, as we move closer to 2050, it's possible that hydrogen will begin to play a part. It's not a significant part in the roadmap that we've identified to 2050, but beyond 2050, I think hydrogen could play a much bigger part, as we expect to see some hydrogen-powered aircraft in the latter years of the road to net zero in 2050. But I think there's scope for everybody to play their part, recognizing that, for example, airports depend on airlines critically, and you've seen the impact from the chart that Mari showed you. If airlines aren't operating, airports don't make any money. Nobody goes to airports to do their shopping. They go to airports to catch a flight. They happen to go shopping while they're waiting to catch their flight. And the evidence is clear to everybody. If airlines don't fly, airports don't operate. And it's important that all parts of the value chain recognize the importance of this transition to net zero. But they cannot expect the cost of it to be solely borne by airlines. Everybody's going to have to play their part.
Great, thank you, Willie. We'll throw it open for questions. So can I ask those in the room to start thinking of some questions? In the meantime, Willie, I'll just ask you one last while people are preparing their thoughts. And that would be maybe taking us to a slightly different topic, which would be diversity. And over the past year, IATA has been quite vocal on the importance of diversity, particularly female representation in the industry. How do you see that issue progressing as we look forward?
Well, I think it's good that we've had quite a bit of traction now from our member airlines and indeed from our strategic partners in making the commitment to the IATA initiative of 25 by 2025. I think people will recognize that this is a nice initiative. It clearly won't be enough, but it is a good start. We are, like all industries, in competition for talent. It's very clear that our industry continues to be one that is dominated, male-dominated, despite the efforts of many airlines over the years. We have to address that. If talent is in short supply, and in effect we're closed off to 50% of the market because women don't see the industry as an attractive industry to join, then we have a major problem. So, this is not one of these nice-to-have initiatives. This is a critical initiative for our industry. We have got to address the gender balance within our industry if we're to have a sustainable business going forward. So I'm pleased that we're making some progress. In fact, we've seen quite a lot of engagement with our program in the past 6 months, so the momentum is very strong. We clearly in IATA have a role to play internally as well as externally, so there is work for all of us to do. But just look around the room. I think the shape of this room tells you everything you need to know about our industry. So more work to be done. Critical issue for us to address, but at least we are making some progress and going in the right direction.
Great. So with that, we'll throw it open to questions. So maybe first question, we'll take Mr. Patra.
Hi, good morning. This is R.K. Patra from Stat Times India. And I would like to add on to your maintenance problem that the airlines are facing today. For your information, recently Air India has taken over by Tata Group, and they have 20 aircraft which were grounded. They have taken charge of that, and 30,000 spare parts within no time they have accumulated, and those aircrafts are flying again. They're airborne. It's good news for the airlines.
Yeah, no, we're aware of individual airline issues. It's not a new issue, but I think what I said is the scale of it is of great concern to us. Clearly wasn't a major problem for a lot of airlines during 2021 and 2022, given the number of aircraft that they had grounded. So access to spare parts, if they couldn't get them direct from the supplier, they were able to access them from the grounded aircraft that they had. But as airlines put aircraft back into service, it is becoming an issue. And as I said, it would be a shame to see the recovery in the industry dented by the lack of spare parts from the OEMs. The issue was particularly highlighted in relation to engine spares, where the challenge was, are the manufacturers, are the OEMs showing preference to new aircraft being produced to the production line rather than aircraft that are in service. So this is something that we will be looking at IATA to gather more data, and you should expect me to be talking a lot more about this in the early months of 2023 as the extent of the problem becomes clearer to us.
Thank you.
Okay, take a question from Chris.
So when do you think we're going to return to meaningful profitability across those traditionally profitable regions? Is that still really hard to predict? Is it going to happen in 2024, or is it impossible to say?
No, I think what we're seeing is we're on the path to recovery towards where we were in 2019. We had talked about getting back to 2019 passenger numbers in 2024. And I think we're still projecting to get there. Some parts of the world will get back earlier in 2023, and some will be later. And that's the problem. This recovery is not at the same pace in every region of the world. I think what you need to reflect on is that this is an industry that is at an aggregate level, and it is important that we point out that there are many highly profitable airlines that have successfully navigated through this crisis. It impacted on the profitability of every airline. Probably the only ones that continue to be profitable through the crisis were the all-cargo operators, given the significant benefit that cargo traffic generated through the period. But as I said, in our best year from memory, 2015 was the year when we made the highest net profit in absolute terms, around 53 billion. It was still only a net margin of around 10%. So there's still quite a long way to go. But the reason I'm optimistic is, when you've come from losing nearly 140 billion in one year, any profit is a positive. So it's the scale of the turnaround that we've seen, 140 billion, almost 138 billion in 2020, 42 billion in 2021, 7 billion losses in 2022, small profit in 2023. So that's why I'm optimistic. We're on the right path. I agree with you fully. Still a long way to go. And for some airlines, that's going to continue to be a major challenge. I think then, one of the things we've got to be positive about as well is cash generation. So the problem the industry faced in 2020 was obviously liquidity with the significant cash burn that the industry witnessed. We are back into generating cash, which is important to sustain airlines through the more difficult period. So a lot of work to be done, a lot of damage done to balance sheets that will need to be repaired, but we're going in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a question in the corner.
Hi, this is Anu Sharma from Mint Newspaper, India. So my question is, firstly, as India has been seen as one of the growing emerging aviation markets in the world. So as you said, that Asia Pacific region will lag recovery, and that is expected around 2024, 2025. So with respect to India specifically, when do you see the recovery happen? And also the supply chain issues, how big that can be and how soon can that be resolved?
Yeah, on the second issue, I'm unclear as to how quickly that can be resolved. I think it is going to be a problem for the industry. And as I said, in the discussions that we had last week with the Board of Governors, it came as a surprise to me the extent to which airlines were experiencing problems. So we're at this stage trying to analyze just how significant that problem is. It certainly is bigger than I thought. In relation to India, yeah, I think we are seeing a much stronger recovery in India than the general region, the Asia-Pacific region. I was just looking there, just to put it into context. So in 2019, the Asia-Pacific region accounted for almost 35% of all traffic globally, clearly a huge market. In the 10 months to the end of October, Asia-Pacific now contributes just under 22% of all traffic. So you can see from 35% in 2019 to 22%, you can see the change that has taken place. And I think it also highlights the potential recovery that's still to come for the industry. But India clearly has seen a strong recovery. I think the challenge in India will be getting aircraft, both new aircraft because of the problems in terms of supply of new aircraft, but also getting spare parts to ensure that the aircraft that were taken out of service can get back into the air. But we would expect India from memory to recover in 2024, but at the pace at which we're seeing change there, that could be sort of early 2024 rather than late 2024. but certainly some very positive developments in India.
Okay, we'll come over to this side of the room. Bruno? Yeah, if you use the mic.
Okay. Bruno Trevidic, Les Echos. We have seen a dramatic increase of ticket prices, especially in Europe, or maybe in the US too. Do you see this trend as a lasting one, a lasting trend? And at what point could it impact the demand?
Yeah, I think we've got to understand the dynamics of this industry. The reason we've seen increased ticket prices is because we've seen significantly increased oil prices. I keep highlighting this. Fuel prices are the single element of an airline's cost base. What we've witnessed in 2022 has been, as you've seen in the presentation, a significant increase in the price of Brent, but more particularly a significant widening of what we call the crack spread, the premium that we pay over the price of Brent for jet fuel, which widened to about 34, 35% in the forecast figures that we have, against what was the average in 2010 to 2019 of 17%. And I've just shown, I have a slide here, which I looked at yesterday. Now, let me be very careful here. This is just a quick analysis of both revenues and fuel costs for the industry. And you can see there the top line, going back to 2000 and out to 2023, that's the revenue per RTK for the industry. And the bottom line there is the fuel cost per RTK. And you can see the correlation. I was surprised. It's 0.93. Very, very close correlation between the price of oil and the revenues. In other words, and if you dig into revenues, you're digging into fares. Now, this is a mix of cargo and passenger, because we can't ignore the fact that a lot of fuel comes from the carriage of cargo, and we can't ignore the fact that a lot of revenue comes from the carriage of cargo as well. But just looking at it there, you can see as the oil prices increase, revenues increase. But that's because costs increase, and the revenues have to reflect the increase in the cost base. There's no escaping that. This industry cannot absorb these significant increases in oil price. So when people talk about we've seen high ticket prices, we've seen high ticket prices because we've seen very high fuel prices. And you cannot expect an industry that's making, on average, $1 profit per passenger to absorb the increase in the oil prices that we've seen. So, I know this isn't, an answer that a lot of people would like to hear, but I think the realities of the industry are very important. If the oil price increases, then ticket prices will have to increase to reflect that increase in the oil price. And this is why I say, going forward, as we start seeing increase in carbon costs, which, as an industry, we will just blend into the cost of fuel, there has to be an impact on ticket prices as the industry transitions to net zero. Because we, from an airline point of view, cannot absorb these increased costs, and ultimately they will have to get passed through to consumers in the case of, or in the form of higher ticket prices. So higher ticket prices today largely reflect the cost that the airlines are facing. And don't forget, it's not just oil prices that we're being challenged with. In Europe in particular, it's air traffic control charges, it's airport charges. All of these have significantly increased in 2022 and are likely to increase again in 2023. But I thought this was an interesting chart just to show you the correlation between the unit fuel costs and unit revenue. And as you can see, almost a perfect correlation between the two.
Great, thank you. Dina, you had a question? Oh, no, behind you. Sorry.
Hi, morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Dina Kamel from the National Abu Dhabi. I had a question about the interplay between capacity and passenger demand next year, how that will play out, and how it will impact airfares going forward. So on the capacity side, are you confident at all that airlines will be able to add seats given the issues with supply chain, with aircraft deliveries, etc.? And on the demand side, will passenger demand continue to be strong even as inflation eats into consumer spending, and how that interaction might affect airfares going forward?
Yeah, so looking at next year, and maybe Murray, you want to comment on this, but we're seeing capacity come back slightly, or capacity growth slightly higher than demand growth, passenger growth, if you look at ASKs and RPKs. But not a huge difference. And again, I was looking at this, so just to give you some figures, if I look at the industry in 2019, October seat factor on aggregate for the industry in 2019 was 82.1%. October this year was 82%. So again, I think what we're seeing is the dynamic between supply and demand being reasonably aligned as we go through this period of recovery and into next year. Slightly more capacity in ASK terms coming back than the expected growth in RPK. So in simple terms, yes, I would expect at an industry level the demand to be met with the capacity that will be required. But again, going to comments about the industry, the demand that we're seeing this year is good, but it's very much aligned with what we would have expected. The return of capacity and the growth in demand seem to be well matched as we go through the year. And just to give you some figures, August 2019 was 85.7, August this year 82.1, September 81.9 in 2019, this year 81.8, and as I said, October in 2019 82.1, this year 82. So you can see actually, not exactly where we were in the peak summer, but the supply and demand, I think, is being well matched as we go through this period of recovery.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll take a question here. Yeah, we'll work on this table in the next couple of questions.
Owen Corrie from Air and Travel in Dublin. Willie, your colleague and friend Michael O'Leary told the Oireachtas Committee last week that even if all the sustainable aviation fuel available was given to Ryanair or available to Ryanair, it would still only fuel 2% of its flights. Is there a stage where we have to reassess whether sustainable aviation fuel is an alternative, or are we ever going to make up a meaningful amount of SAF that will be delivered to airlines that we can, as an industry, present as an alternative in the great environmental debate?
It's a great comment, and I would agree with Michael. He's looking at what's available today, not at what we need to be made available. And this is where I think we see a big divergence in the approach being adopted in the US and the approach being adopted in Europe. In the US, they've recognized for some time now that the development of sustainable aviation fuels is the big part of the answer, and they are heavily focused on additional production. We're not seeing it to the same degree in Europe. I think the regulators are in this debate around, do we mandate the airlines or mandate the airports? It's a nonsense. Mandating an airline to buy something that isn't available makes no sense whatsoever. Mandating airports to make something available that isn't available makes no sense whatsoever. And what we're seeing here is that all this is doing is leading to a situation, if you take France, for example, where there's a requirement to make, I think it's 1% of fuel available through SAF. It isn't available. If you can't make it available, you have to pay a penalty. So this is Europe's answer to the problem. Let's penalize people. We need the policy framework that supports greater production. Now, the feedstock are there. The pathways to create sustainable fuels are clear, approved, scientifically tested. The evidence is very clear. These fuels will make a big difference. We just need greater production. So will we see greater production? I've no doubt that we will. Are we seeing what we need today? No, we're not. So Michael's quite right to highlight the problem that exists today. He's quite right to, in his case, because he's operating within Europe, to express the concern that he would face if Europe continued to mandate airlines to use something that they can't buy. Like, what sense is there in that? So you have to question what's the objective that Europe is pursuing. Is it genuinely trying to transition to a net zero economy, or is it trying to just penalize people for where they are today? We believe that the way forward is to have the right framework in place, to incentivize that framework, and to produce high volume, widespread availability of sustainable fuels that will address the problem.
Okay. Gianni, I know you have been waiting for a while. Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm here. Hi, Willie. Gianni Dragoni, Il Sole 24 Ore Italy. I have two questions. One is about the figures that Mary illustrated. Sorry, I cannot find the average ticket price that IATA assumes for 22, 23. Maybe can you clarify? And the other question for Willie is, many airlines are willing to fly aircraft with only one pilot. Would you fly with an aircraft with only one pilot?
Well, given that I was a pilot, yeah, I would, because I'd be happy to sit into the one seat and take over if necessary. But yeah, I think this is a debate that will go on for a long time. Do I expect to see a single pilot operation in an aircraft in the next 10, 15 years? No, I don't. Are there reasons why we shouldn't be looking at it? Well, I think the advances in technology have clearly been massive. I look at the technology that was available when I first flew a 737-200 back in 1980 compared to the technology on the aircraft today. It's night and day. I don't expect to see a move to a single pilot operation for, if ever, but certainly I don't see it in the next 15, 20, maybe even 25 years. The figures, we don't give an average ticket price, but I know you're all good at doing your maths, and we give you revenue figures and we give you average passenger numbers, and in fact we give you passenger numbers, we give you passenger revenue, we give you cargo revenue, so it's quite easy to just to work it out. We can't do all the work for you.
All right, Karen?
Sorry about that. Hi there, Karen Walker, Air Transport Board. So I hear what you're saying about costs, and that's being, that will be necessary to hand on to the passengers. One of the things you haven't talked about is labour costs. In particular in the US, we're seeing very strong union action that so far they are winning, getting very high upgrades in compensation. Isn't that part of the, change of business model that's needed?
I think what you're seeing in the US is particular to the US. So the recent Delta pilot deal, which as I understand it, represents increases of almost 30% over 3 or 4 years. I can't remember, Karen, maybe you can correct me. But it also seemed to include a clause that they will get paid at least 1% more than United and American. And it really just does highlight the fact that there's a clear focus on the domestic market, because they're not looking at their competition relative to other global carriers. It's competition within the US domestic market. And I can understand that, given that if I look at the first 10 months of this year, domestic travel in North America, based on our figures, is 70% of all of their travel. So it's a much bigger market for them. And what we've seen in the US is that the pilot shortage, which is particular to the US and is particular to the requirements to have minimum number of hours to fly a commercial jet aircraft in the US, is causing the problem there. And unless that changes, and I can't see that changing, then you're going to have a structural shortage of pilots in the US. You don't have the same problem in the rest of the world, and you don't have the same regulation in the rest of the world. And quite frankly, the regulation in the US was an answer to a particular challenge in the US. I flew a 737-200 with commercial passengers for a total of 210 hours and 10 minutes. That was my total flying time. But I did a structured training program from start to finish that was designed to train me to fly a commercial jet aircraft. The benefit of a program like that is very different to somebody who just has hours flying around and you see them out here in a Cherokee or a Cessna. The value of those hours, in my opinion, are very limited, if any. In fact, I can't see much value to them at all. So you have a particular problem in the US with pilot shortages that will continue for some time. The US airlines seem to be happy just to concentrate on competition within the US. It clearly makes the US airlines less competitive on the global scale, particularly with a high cost base and a dollar-denominated cost base against other parts of the world with a non-dollar denominated cost base, given the appreciation of the dollar. But I can understand that reflects the dynamics of the US. It's not the dynamics of the global aviation industry.
Can I jump in there? Sorry, just feel like adding to the conversation by the fact that this is absolutely uniquely positive, that we have these very buoyant labor markets for the world economy as a whole. I think we might be the closest to full employment in the global economy that we've ever seen. And of course, this rebalances the bargaining power between capital and labor, which has, for the past number of decades been very much in favor of capital. So this is, it helps us fight the risk of global recession, and it's just really positive for individuals that they can actually work and earn, even, as we said earlier, those earnings, the purchasing power of those earnings is reduced by the rate of inflation, of course. But we can anticipate that at some point this red-hot labor market is going to cool somewhat, and that comes back to the question from the lady from Abu Dhabi, that when can we think that there will be a greater price sensitivity in the demand for air transportation? And I would argue that that's probably going to be around the time when we see unemployment rates rising again. And then, of course, we have to be a bit circumspect as to what these potential increases in unemployment means, because we had an uptick in the US unemployment rate, for instance, but accompanied by a monthly job creation of 263,000. So that's a positive increase in the unemployment rate, if I can put it that way. So when we start seeing less job creation on a monthly or quarterly or whatever basis, that's when we can, logically speaking, start to anticipate that the price sensitivity of demand in our industry is going to increase. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a question here.
Willie, my name is Andreas Scholz, a freelance journalist from Hamburg. You mentioned the closure of Russian airspace. This created a lot of imbalances, especially between Europe and China. Do you see that this imbalance will continue? And many airlines, like you mentioned, Finnair, were forced to change completely their business model. So do you see that this will be solved somehow, or that European carriers especially have to look for new income sources in order to compete against China? Chinese airlines.
Yeah, I think there are two issues that you highlight. One is the closure of China, largely to passengers because of the restrictions. And the second issue is the operation of flights from China into Europe, with Chinese carriers continuing to fly through Russian airspace. So they're two separate issues. As we see China relax restrictions and reopen, then the issue of access through Russian airspace becomes a bigger question for the European carriers. particularly if it remains open for Chinese carriers to fly to Europe. So I think this will become an issue. My own view is I think we have to look to the reopening of Russian airspace so that both the European carriers can access Asia by overflying Russia. Now, they may want to consider whether that's something they want to do, but they'll need to do an individual analysis of that. But certainly from an IATA point of view, I believe the solution there is that we should be looking to reopen Russian airspace to have it accessible to all airlines to transit through the traditional Siberian overflights so that Europe can access Asia in the most efficient way possible. So two separate issues. One is the impact of the closure of China as a result of the restrictions, and the second then is overflying Russian airspace. I think the reopening of China, we've talked about the reopening of Russian airspace is something that I think will have to be debated as we go through 2023.
Okay, thank you. We'll stay at this table as well. So,
good morning, Laura from the South China Morning Post. Yeah, you mentioned China as being a key variable to recovery. Looking at Hong Kong, it's been recently opened its third runway. It wants to kind of have further collaboration with Zhuhai. But what is your view on Hong Kong as a hub in the short and long term? And with China's continuing restrictions, how is that sort of hindering Hong Kong's hub status?
Yeah, I think Hong Kong as a hub has clearly been severely impacted as a result of the restrictions there. And without question, other hubs are benefiting from the problems that Hong Kong has experienced. The recovery of Hong Kong as a global hub, I think, will take some considerable time. And it's not just the relaxing of the restrictions, it's having confidence that those restrictions won't be reintroduced. Because I think what caused a lot of concern for airlines were the way in which the restrictions were being relaxed and reintroduced at short notice. So it was proving to be very difficult for them to plan their capacity. And as we continue to look at recovery and as airlines bring more capacity back, I think there will be a greater sensitivity to those markets that are unpredictable. So we would need to see, I think, greater stability in Hong Kong in terms of the regulations that apply, because without question, airlines just got fed up with the changing regulations almost overnight. So they were planning capacity into Hong Kong. The regulation would change. They were getting flights stuck in Hong Kong, crews stuck there. They're not going to take that risk. So we will need to see greater stability before I think we can talk seriously about the recovery of Hong Kong as a hub. But I think the damage to the status of Hong Kong as a hub has been very significant.
okay, we'll take a question here. You've been very patient.
Thank you. Emma Farge from Reuters. A question on the delays in manufacturing suites. We've seen Airbus obviously having some big delays. Can you comment on how big a problem this is?
Can you move the mic a bit closer?
So. Thank you. Emma Farge from Reuters. A question on the manufacturers, please. We've seen delays from Airbus. I was wondering how big a problem is this? What is the average delay, and when can you expect to see an improvement there? Thanks.
Yeah, I think this is one that individual airline CEOs are extremely frustrated about. And I know if I was back in my previous role, it would be of great concern to me. I can't give you averages because it very much depends on the orders and the deliveries. But what we are seeing is a lot of frustration about the delivery. This is a very complex issue for airlines. They plan to bring capacity in. They plan to have the right number of crews available, particularly training pilots, engineers, and then they can't have any guarantee around the delivery of the aircraft that they have ordered. So it's causing a lot of frustration. It is adding to the cost base, and I think when I talk privately to CEOs, it's something that is very it's creating a lot of anger. Now, how that translates into the relationship between individual airlines and the manufacturers will be interesting to watch. I think that's something that the individual airlines will need to address. But I know if it was me, I'd be extremely angry with both Airbus and Boeing. It's not just one; it's both over the delays to the deliveries and the lack of certainty that the airlines are being given around when aircraft will be delivered. So yeah, very frustrating.
Okay, we'll take a question in the front.
Hello, my name is Ricardo. Hello, my name is Ricardo De Piero from Aeronaves Chile. Consider you say that the airlines can fly if the airline can't fly, the airports can operate. So, what do you think? What is the situation of the airports in Latin America? Consider the lack of infrastructure in Lima, the inefficiency in Santiago, in Bogota. Do you have an?
Yeah, infrastructure has been a challenge in the region for some time, so it's not new. And it is frustrating when you can see the prospect of significant growth in traffic, but that growth will be impeded by the infrastructure that's in place. From an airline point of view, what we want is cost-efficient infrastructure made available at the right time. It's rare that we get to see that. I think the situation in Latin America is not new. This has been evident for some years. To be fair, I think there are airports that are trying to address this situation and bring additional capacity or better utilize the capacity that they have. And that's the first thing that we argue at IATA. Don't build more capacity until you're using the capacity you have in the most efficient way possible. And we have been assisting some airports and some governments to identify ways of improving the capacity based on the existing infrastructure, looking at best practice from other airports around the world. So, I think the opportunity in the region is actually to try and maximize the available capacity that's there. And then to look at what additional capacity needs to be developed. But it is something that we are working with both the airlines in the region, but also some of the airports in the region to try and address, because there clearly is a very strong opportunity for additional growth in that market.
Okay, thank you. You've been very patient, so we'll take a question here. And after that, we'll move towards the back of the room.
Hello, this is Ren Takla from Arab News, Saudi Arabia. So my question would be that going forward, do you expect the market dynamics in the Middle East in particular to differ from the rest of the world? And if yes, how? And if no, why not?
So I better say yes and no. So the region has clearly had significant benefit from the hubs there in recent years. And we've seen fantastic growth at the two major hubs in the Middle East, Dubai and Doha. If I go back maybe even 10 years ago, I was asked about whether I could see the three hubs in the Middle East succeed. At the time, Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi. And I said that I could see a strong argument for two hubs, but I struggled to see how three closely located hubs could succeed. And I think that's been the case with the reevaluation of both the network of Etihad and their focus now on ensuring that they have a long-term sustainable business and less as a global hub. So when we look at current traffic flows, Middle East to North America is above where it was in 2019. Middle East to Asia is recovering faster than other markets. So it's clear that the dynamics in the hubs in the Middle East continue to be slightly different to the rest of the world. And the recovery in some of those key markets is actually stronger than other key markets. I think the thing we've got to recognize in the Middle East is that effectively no domestic market. You know, it's very small. These are international markets, and therefore they were more heavily impacted by the downturn in international travel because of the border restrictions, because they had a much smaller domestic market to rely on. Even in Europe, the domestic market, from memory, was about, in 2019, about 12% of the total market. And we saw that recover quickly in 2021 and 2022. So the dynamics that we've witnessed in terms of recovery have been an accelerated recovery in domestic markets, so therefore benefiting, first and foremost, North America, very strong domestic market. It was benefiting China until China went into regional lockdowns. The same in Australia, you know, when they removed the restrictions between interstate travel or across states in Australia. So domestic markets recovered quickly, which meant the initial recovery in the Middle East lagged other regions. But now as international traffic is recovering, the recovery in the Middle East is accelerating beyond other markets. So the dynamics are different, reflecting the structure of the market for carriers in the Middle East. And I would expect that to continue. Middle East carriers have also benefited to some degree from the closure of Russian airspace and therefore the rerouting of traffic flows. So we've seen connecting traffic over the Middle East benefit to some degree from that, and that was one of the issues that was highlighted in the presentation, or in behind the figures in terms of the acceleration in recovery in the Middle East profitability. So yeah, different dynamics. I expect those dynamics to be positive and to continue to benefit the major hubs. Beyond that, then you've got to look at what Saudi wants to do, but that's a completely different story. You know, they clearly have huge ambition in terms of developing Saudi Arabia as a tourist destination, and what that will mean for traffic flows into and out of Saudi Arabia. But I think that's maybe something we could talk about, not this year, but maybe next year or the year after, when we may see some tangible evidence of that development in Saudi Arabia.
Okay, great. We'll go right to the back of the room. Yes. And then over there.
Sorry, can you use the microphone or bring it closer? Can't really hear you.
Is that working now? Thanks. Sorry, always technology. It's Oliver Gill from the Daily Telegraph. Just want to clarify one point. You said about you'd be keen to reopen the Russian airspace. Is that during the time when they are still engaging in a war with Ukraine?
No, I think we have to look at what's happening there, and then, you know, I think the issue in Russia is not just the war, which we want to end, but then what will the impact of what has happened be longer term in terms of, you know, Russia and its place. But clearly, this is going to become a major issue for European air travel as airspace over Europe becomes restricted. So even if you look at the closure of Ukrainian airspace, Russian airspace, and other parts of the world, the amount of traffic that's flowing through Europe has increased over certain routes, and that's not sustainable. So longer term, we're going to have to see a return to more normal operations. But the issue is, if Russian airspace is open for some, but not all, you have to question, why is it closed to some and not all? And that's the debate that I think we're going to have as we go through 2023.
But you are saying that you'd wait until those hostilities end? You'd wait until the hostilities end before you
well,
consider?
I think we have to hope that the hostilities end, well, the war ends, let's call it what it is. It's a war, that ends, yeah.
Okay, we'll take a question in the back corner. No.
Hi, good morning. Kotov from Air Transport World. We talk about consolidation of airlines industry in Europe for many years. Do you think that more airlines will disappear now the coming winter? Or do have airlines already some money left to buy other airlines?
I think we identified that there were 85 airlines that went out of business during 2021 and 2020, 2021, and the early part of 2022. And from memory, about 45 airlines started. Murray, I don't know if you can remember exactly, but so we have seen quite a number of airlines fail. Most of these were small and relatively insignificant. I think the challenge for some airlines still exists because, as we've seen, and the earlier question, the industry is still only marginally profitable. It's in effect in Europe, you could say we're break even. So there's clearly still financial pressures on a lot of airlines. The difference is airlines are generating cash now, and liquidity was the critical issue, and the difference between survival and going out of business in 2021. So being able to access liquidity was a critical issue for all airlines. So I think those that have survived to this point have got through the worst of it, but I don't think anybody can be complacent. There's still a lot of work to go. But I'm not looking at any significant change in the industry. When I look around the European industry, it's very fragmented, but it's always been very fragmented. I think there is a strong case for consolidation in Europe, but consolidation through normal M&A activity, given the state of balance sheets at the moment, I personally felt that the industry is going to be more cautious. But there will be opportunities, and I think those opportunities may well appear in 2023. We know, for example, there has been some interest in acquiring ITA. We know that TAP is probably going to look for new owners, and there will be interest in both of those airlines. Whether it leads to a change or not, I don't know. But I think there may well be some limited consolidation taking place in the industry in Europe in 2023.
Okay, thank you. And we'll go.
Murray?
Can I jump
in?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in with the fact that in 2021 we had fewer airline deaths and more airline births than we did in 2019. So this shows this continued investor interest, after all, in our industry, which tends to happen, of course, when the industry is under pressure, so that the capital involved in setting up a new airline is lower. And for sure, with the whole value chain discussion, we can all understand that there's ample opportunities for evolutions in how the market is set up. But in addition to that, I just wanted to highlight something that Willie alluded to as well, which is this level playing field, yeah? That if we want to have a strong value chain and allow airlines to operate effectively and efficiently across the globe, well, then we need this level playing field. And, it seems to me that no sooner had every country signed the Chicago Convention that they just went home and started to work against it. And this is important, again, coming back to the labor situation, that we in aviation do not have a level playing field in labor markets. If we could bring such an outcome about, then obviously that would be a way to address some of the issues that we're facing there now. So whenever countries introduce specific regulation on a specific area, it lowers the efficiency of our industry and makes it more complicated to provide the global connectivity that the world needs. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a question just behind.
Yes, Eric Renet from newspaper Le Soir in Belgium. A short question about your forecast for 2023 for the price of aviation fuel and SAF.
So 2023, Murray, you have the figures there at Brent at $92.3 US dollars and jet kerosene at 111.9. But listen, if we could forecast the price of fuel, I can guarantee you, Murray and I would not be sitting up here. We'd be off somewhere else. So that's an assessment based on everything that we can see as to what the price of Brent and the price of jet is likely to be in 2023. The one thing I can say for certain is we will be wrong.
But the price of SAF?
Yeah, we don't have a forecast for that. If I look at it today, on average, during the last 4 months, The premium of sustainable aviation fuel over kerosene has been about 2.1. So sustainable fuel has been 2.1 times, very roughly, the price of traditional jet kerosene. That's a smaller margin than we were used to. It principally reflects the higher price of kerosene. So it's not that SAF has necessarily become cheaper, it's that kerosene, the traditional jet kerosene, has become more expensive.
Sorry, can you repeat the jet A price? Jet A forecast?
So we said Brent at 92.3, jet at 111.9.
And I just wanted to add to that, that what we can say with a certain amount of confidence, of course, is that the price is likely to be volatile. And we will see spikes of that, I remain convinced, in both crude and jet. And one of those spikes is likely to occur around February, because on the 5th of February, Europe will impose embargo on Russian energy exports. So that's one time when we can expect the price to spike above 100 again. And then we all collectively tend to emotionally imprint on these spikes, yeah? But the average tends to be much lower than our mental integration of the oil price. So I think this is how we can present these rather encouraging averages around which we should expect a high degree of volatility. And for jet fuel, again, in particular, we are likely to face a scarcity of capacity in refining capacity. So that too is likely to keep the crack spread elevated also through 2023.
Okay, thanks, Marie. Just watching the clock, we're at 10:44, so we're 60 seconds from the end of the embargo. We're meant to end this session at 10:45. We'll try and take one last question, and then we'll go to break. So over here.
Thank you. Tanguy Kemenel with AFP Newswire, based in Paris. Just wondering about 2024. Do you still see that year as the one where the sector finally reaches back the level of 2019 RPKs?
In passenger numbers. There's a difference between RPKs and passenger numbers. We expect passenger numbers to recover by 2024. So the shape of the market is going to be slightly different, which has an impact on RPKs. They're not exactly the same, but not a million miles apart from one another.
Okay, great. And with that, my watch says 10:45, so the embargo is over and the coffee break is on. So thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed that session. Again, you have the 2 press releases. If you have any questions about them, let us know. And Mr. Walsh will be around for today and tomorrow. So there'll be plenty of opportunities also if you need some extra comments. So thank you very much.